Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today we are speaking with Ms. Shikha Dalmia about the Flint water crisis. Ms. Dalmia is a senior analyst with the Reason Foundation, a columnist at The Week, and a Bloomberg View contributor. She writes regularly for Reason magazine and is often featured in the Wall Street Journal, The Times of London, Time, USA Today, and The Daily Beast. She previously served as a columnist for Forbes and The Washington Examiner. You can follow her work on Reason.com, and you can find her on Twitter at Shikha Dalmia and on Facebook under Shikha Dalmia. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/Flint. Shikha, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on, Adam.
Sure. Well, it's our pleasure to have you with us. So to get started, can you give us a sense of the fiscal situation in Flint and how bad the mismanagement has been in that city?
Flint, as you know, is a Rust Belt city a little north of Detroit and about 60 miles from where I live. And with the decline of the auto industry and manufacturing in general, Flint, which used to be a very flourishing town, has seen some hard days. Its population is a fraction of what it was. It's, about 100,000 people now. And quite like Detroit, this reduced population is having to support a very vast infrastructure. And this basic structural problem hasn't been helped by decades of misgovernance, essentially by, democratic political officials. Flint has been giving very lavish public pension and other benefits because of union pressure, so for years now, actually, it has been under a state emergency manager. It wasn't quite close to bankruptcy as Detroit came, but its books were in pretty bad, in a pretty bad situation. And so the emergency manager, since I think it was 2011, had been trying to clean up its fiscal accounts and bring some semblance of balance. And that is still the situation, actually, at this point. There's really no good way to balance the books for Flint in a way that'll make it structurally sound going forward.
So give us a quick overview of kind of the status of the water in Flint originally and what changed.
So, what happened was that as the city was in under the state emergency manager, at the same time, Flint's contract with the Detroit Water and Sewage Department, which was a 30-year contract, was up for renegotiations. And Flint decided, and which is something that it had wanted to do, that it didn't want to stick with Detroit anymore. Its own county, where it's located, called Genesee County, was setting up a parallel water system. And and Flint wanted to switch to this water system. The problem, however, was that there was going to be 1 year in the interim when its contract with Detroit expired, but its new contract with the Carangonde Water Authority wasn't going to kick in. Now, the media, the liberal media over here and nationally, has been billing this switch as an austerity measure by this cost-cutting, emergency manager put in place by this evil Republican governor. Actually, that couldn't be further from the truth. The new contract with the Genesee County Water Authority was going to cost Flint hundreds of millions of dollars more over the course of the 30-year period. But in the interim, as I said, it needed to do something. Now, instead of renegotiating an interim contract with Detroit, which is what the rest of Genesee County did, as it happened, there was this mothballed local water plant which was drawing water from the Flint River, which is a toxic, which has been used as sort of a toxic dump for local industry. So the emergency manager and the mayor and some of the local politicians just decided that they were just going to reopen this plant in the interim and have nothing to do with Detroit. And there's a long history for that. I mean, the two sides have had bad blood, Detroit Water Sewage Department and Flint, and a lot of the Detroit's regional customers have never quite gotten along. And I think Flint was kind of fed up with it. But in any case, this turned out to be a terrible, terrible move, reopening this mothballed plant. Because first of all, the water that it was drawing in was of far worse quality than the Huron water that Detroit was drawing upon. And second of all, instead of treating it properly, Flint simply did not have the in-house scientific expertise to understand how to make this water safe. It wasn't an expensive thing to do. What caused the lead poisoning in Flint was not that this water actually had excessive amount of lead. It was that it actually had excessive amount of bacteria. And to control that bacteria, they had to use too much chlorine. So which made the water acidic. So when the water, when it flew through the pipes, it corroded the inside coating of the pipe and causing the lead from the pipe to actually leach into the water supply. The simple solution to this was actually to add just phosphorus, which is prescribed, which is standard protocol, especially when you have too much chlorine in the water. And phosphorus costs nothing at all. It costs something like $50,000 annually. But because of complete negligence and incompetence of various government agencies, both at the federal, state, local level, that never happened. And the coating in the pipes corroded and people started getting, lead-laced water, which is what then caused the problem.
Now, as for the switch away from the Detroit system, you mentioned that a lot of this had to do with it being a jobs program and a stimulus program. Is that the main reason why the switch was made? Are there other factors that went in? Was there? I know you mentioned negligence as well. That was obviously a factor. But why did they decide to make this switch?
Right. I mean, yeah, there were many factors. That was not the only factor. The main factor was that Detroit had, Detroit Water and Sewage Department had its own problems. It had, that Detroit the DWSD had also been under court receivership for a long time because of corruption, because of mismanagement. It was all its regional customers in the surrounding counties felt that it was always overcharging for its water. They wanted to be able to actually have a say in the management of this authority. And Detroit, which is a African American dominated city, felt that this was an effort by the white suburbs to come in and take over control. And so they were, so this problem had been going on for a long time. And part of the reason that Flint wanted to switch from DWSD to the Genesee County Water Authority was it just was fed up with Detroit. But that was one of the motives. Now, when actually Detroit came and it gave Flint its new contract, offered it the terms, it was the water authority at that time was under a court-appointed manager. And she was, this new manager was actually an extremely competent woman. She was a technocrat. She didn't have this bad history of, political posturing that had caused all the problems with Detroit's customers in the past. And she very badly wanted to make a deal with Flint. And she was offering them extremely, extremely sweet terms. She was even giving Flint membership on the board. She said, look, if you are worried about future water rate hikes, I will let you have representation on the board so that you can have some say and some control over all of that. But at that point, Flint officials and the state, appointed emergency manager just didn't want to have anything to do with any of that. even though some of their own internal independent studies by various engineering companies were showing that it would be more expensive to make the switch away from Detroit rather than stick with Detroit. And one of the reasons that they didn't want to stick with Detroit was that they felt that this was an infrastructure, stimulus plan. And I actually, after I wrote this piece and questions were raised about whether a stimulus was really part of the agenda, I went back and there was the drain commissioner at that time was actively making this argument about how many jobs this new project would produce. And, the Genesee County water system, the new system, the Carongonde water system, it actually would have been less viable if Flint had not gone along with it, because Flint would have been one of its major customers. So, and then that would have meant fewer jobs for the county and for Flint and what have you. So this was the stimulus aspect of it. The jobs infrastructure aspect of it was definitely a part of it, but it wasn't the only part. But the point is, unlike what the mainstream media has been spinning, that this was an austerity move, that, because a Republican governor had appointed an emergency manager who was trying to balance the books of Flint, they were just trying to pinch, every penny they could, even if that meant giving lead poisoned water to citizens of Flint. That part of the narrative is completely wrong, in my opinion.
So tell us a bit more about the water from the Flint River. When they tested it originally and found that they could add phosphorus to the water to make it okay, why wasn't that decision made? I know you said there was a lot of negligence, but who was responsible for not making that decision?
Well, so when Flint switched from Detroit to this Flint River, which was back in 2014, residents immediately, the consumers of this water in Flint, immediately noticed that the water quality had changed quite a bit. The water didn't taste right, it didn't smell right, it didn't look right. And they started complaining to city authorities, saying, "Look, this is not right." At that point, they started doing various water tests. The local authorities and the DEQ, the State Department of Environmental Quality, but what happened was that the EPA has something called the lead and copper rule, and which prescribes how water has to be collected and what the safe lead level content in the tested water ought to be. The problem was that the DEQ was having the residents flush their pipes at night before it collected water the next morning. And this process that they were using, to collect the water samples was artificially lowering the lead content in the water that was being tested. Now, independent tests were showing the lead levels to be higher than what the DEQ tests were showing, but the DEQ was not willing to accept those. At the same time that they were testing, the lead level in the bloodstream of children and other people who were consuming that water, and DEQ tests, and there were some Department of Environmental Quality tests that showed a slightly higher level of lead in bloodstreams, but they attributed that to a seasonal anomaly. To cut a long story short, so DEQ was sort of sticking to this line that there was no problem with the water quality. Meanwhile, independent tests by various agencies were showing that there was a problem. There was EPA's own, the Department of Environmental Quality, which is a federal agency which was overseeing the DEQ. Some of their officials had actually gone and done their own tests and were finding problems. So EPA, which is supposed to oversee the DEQ, realized that there was a problem. Their own reports were showing there was a problem, but they decided that it was not their job to actually go public with their findings, that it was up to the DEQ to inform Flint residents that there was an issue. Meanwhile, the governor, who was depending upon his DEQ staff to give him the right information, was getting all the wrong information. Now, the governor's own aides actually had raised questions about the water quality, And they were assured that there was nothing wrong with it by the DEQ. Meanwhile, the Department of Health in Michigan was similarly, testing people for, lead levels and concluding that there was no problem with it. It was only when a local hospital tested, conducted independent tests that it all came together last September, and they realized that there was genuinely a problem. And that's when kind of like, the proverbial, shit hit the fan, and this became a massive scandal. But till about last September, it was all, they were keeping quiet about it. They were not going public with their concerns. The information that they knew was not being shared. In fact, the local mayor of Flint was going around assuring residents that there's nothing wrong with water quality. His family is drinking the same water that everybody else is drinking. And in fact, if people went out and bought water bottles, they would be just wasting their precious dollars, is what he actually told residents. So he wouldn't even, they wouldn't even let people, take steps on their own dime to correct the situation. They were continuously misleading the people and about the extent of the problem. And that's what's so terrible and negligent, about this whole incident.
Now, you mentioned several officials and agencies in there that are responsible for negligence and for contributing to this issue. It seems like in the national media, all the blame is placed on Governor Snyder, but you also pointed out that the former mayor of Flint, Dane Walling, contributed to this, and the Department of Environmental Quality and the EPA. So where would you say blame should most appropriately be placed? And is all of this blame that's being attributed to Governor Snyder appropriate, or is it overblown?
Look, I mean, there is no question about it. I think Snyder is responsible. I mean, this all happened on the watch of his emergency manager that he appointed, and the emergency manager, signed off on a lot of these decisions. He signed off on the decision to switch to the Flint River system. He signed off on, on poo-pooing the concerns of Flint residents. So there is no question about it that Snyder, if he's not directly responsible for it, he's at least indirectly responsible in that, the city was basically under his charge when this whole scandal happened. But that said, there is plenty of blame to go around. I think the state agencies whom Snyder was managing were definitely at fault. The EPA was definitely at fault, which was a federal agency. The local authorities, the mayor was definitely at fault that he was not giving the correct information to people. So there is no one entity one can blame. There is a failure of government across the board, in this episode. So, I mean, my only problem, I don't have an issue with the national press blaming Snyder. I think they should blame not just him, and then they should blame him for the right reasons. The blame over here is incompetence. The blame over here is not austerity. So that's very important to keep in mind, when we look for future ways to kind of like avoid similar problems in the future.
And what exactly is the extent of the health problem in Flint? Are we going to be seeing more reports out of Flint for decades to come about the lasting health issues due to this crisis?
Well, there's already been an outbreak of Legionnaire's disease, which is a pretty rare form of pneumonia linked to higher lead levels. And, I mean, the numbers are not huge, but, it's, I think, a few hundred people, if I remember correctly. But the larger problem is the children who have been exposed to higher lead levels. There is no amount of safe lead in water. And excessive lead does cause permanent, brain damage, all kinds of health issues. So I think these, children are definitely, going to be exposed to it. They have now controlled the problem. They have installed water filters in people's homes. and so lead levels have gone back to normal. So I think they have contained the problem. But it's not just the health issues which are at stake over here. Bear in mind that Flint is a very depressed city and without a lot of jobs. Its property values in the city had already been falling. Now, after this whole debacle, given that the piping, the water infrastructure has been quite severely damaged, due to the corrosion effect, changing this water infrastructure is going to cost over $1 billion. There is not enough money in the city to be able to, expend that kind of, expend those kinds of resources. So these people, Flint residents, are stuck in homes that they cannot sell, because if they were to sell them, they would pretty much lose their nest egg in a city that has no jobs. So it is a human catastrophe, to have these people stuck over there. And, I wrote a piece that the kindest and the cheapest and the most effective thing that we could do for them is not try and rebuild the infrastructure of the city, because the city is not, it's not likely to flourish again anytime soon. There's no industry over there. And in any case, that would take a long time. We should just evacuate these people. We should get private companies. We should raise money from whatever sources we can. If the federal government wants to pitch in, fine. Whoever wants to pitch in, go to Warren Buffett, go to Mark Zuckerberg, raise several $billions and just move these people out elsewhere. Because trying to make them better in the city is going to be a more expensive and a more futile effort, in my view.
Well, that's definitely not a good prescription for the people of Flint, I guess. So it sounds like not only is this problem bad now, but it's not going away.
Yeah.
But I want to go back to something you discussed briefly earlier, and that is the recognition of this issue by some before it became a major scandal. Now, I know you've written that General Motors decided to stop using water from Flint before this became a national scandal. And I've also seen that state employees in Flint received clean water after they became aware of the issue. So can you talk a little bit about the recognition of this issue by General Motors, by state employees and others, and what eventually happened for this to become a full-blown national scandal like it is now?
This was the interesting thing, that at the same time that the Flint mayor was going around telling people that the water was perfectly safe, General Motors was noticing that its auto parts were, getting corroded by the water, and actually switched. They stopped using, this water. That was, that's all coming, that's all. That information is becoming available now. What caused this scandal to blow up was that the EPA employee who had done, I forget, Del Toro is his name, he had written up a memo for EPA explaining the water quality problems. That memo was released to the local ACLU, and the story broke in the local papers. And meanwhile, University of Virginia had also sent a team of their scientists to test water quality, and it became very apparent from their results that there was a problem in the water quality. Meanwhile, a local hospital had started testing lead levels in blood samples drawn from high-risk residents. When all of this information started getting leaked to the press is when, this scandal, when the exact extent of this scandal became known. That's when Governor Snyder declared an emergency and started to take steps to correct the situation. But till it was, till the whistleblowers came, till the reports were behind the backs of the authorities, leaked to the press, the effort at that point was just to kind of do damage control and not take aggressive steps to fix the problem.
And what are some of the suits that are being proposed right now? Are people trying to sue the government over this?
Yeah, so that's the other, travesty of the situation is, I have made a case that if this doesn't make a case for privatizing water utilities and other public services, I don't know what will. Because government is actually protected from something called the doctrine of sovereign immunity from lawsuits when it endangers public health. And the rationale for sovereign immunity is that you don't, because the government, is basically has got no other means for paying up except for taxing, residents, that you don't want to open the government to frivolous lawsuits because that would be basically, sticking up taxpayers for money. So the government is protected from sovereign immunity unless it consents to be sued. Now, not very many governments consent to being, sued. So there is an effort by Flint residents to launch a class action lawsuit, but what they have to do is prove reckless negligence on the part of government officials. That's a very, very high burden, legal burden to meet, and not too many people think that Flint residents will actually be able to meet that burden. So some of the big law firms, which actually, in the case of other similar scandals. So, for instance, in California, in Southern California, there has been a similar case where a private company allowed natural gas to leak out and it jeopardized the health of local residents. And in that case, a bunch of lawyers have actually swooped on the company with all kinds of class action lawsuits, and they're going to get a very generous settlement. Those same lawyers are refusing, at least last time I checked, to participate in the class action lawsuit in Flint because they simply don't think that sovereign immunity will allow, much to come of it. So, so there is a lawsuit, but frankly, its odds of success are not looking very good.
Now, you talked about your idea that the city be evacuated, but where do you think all of this is likely headed? What solutions do you think might come to be? How do you think local, state, and federal officials are going to act, and what do you think is going to happen to the people of Flint in the near future?
So, obviously, they are not going to be relocated. I don't think, that anybody is really going to take me up on that suggestion. I think there is an effort. The local state politicians are making an effort to get money from the federal government. So Debbie Stabenow is at the forefront of this. And there is going to be a vote in Congress, I believe, next week on a $250 million aid package to Flint. Similarly, the state is making some funds available to the tune of $100 million. And, I think all of that will make some difference in giving immediate relief to Flint residents. But the actual cost of just changing all the water pipes, is something close to, over $1 billion. So to really fix the situation, there isn't enough money in the system to actually, fix the whole situation. So I think what's going to happen is that the Flint residents will get some relief. They'll get some relief from their medical bills. They will see some effort to replace help them with their own plumbing costs to change the water systems in their own homes. And other than that, I think they'll be out of luck, frankly. I don't think much more will come of it.
Ooh, that's a tough thing to hear.
Yeah, it's a very, very sad situation. It really is a terrible situation. But I just don't see what else they'll do. I think they will try and shovel as much money as they can, but it's not going to be enough. And then after that, after they've shoveled some money, they'll just declare that the problem has been fixed, and people's attention will move elsewhere. The media will start talking about some other new Flint scandal, and that'll be the end of it, really.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show and telling us all this great information about the Flint water crisis. Do you have any recommended readings, and how can our listeners follow your work?
So they can go to reason.com, and I've written several pieces on this, and I write about this regularly. They can follow my work on it. There are other people at Reason who write on this issue. I think actually, not to toot my own horn, but I think Reason has really done some of the best coverage of this issue.
Well, great. I just want to remind everybody to go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/Flint. That's the show notes page for this episode, and we will link to reason.com. We'll link to some of your pieces. We have a list of pieces that we plan to link to from the week and Reason. So thank you for covering this issue in so much depth and so much detail, and thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes, or subscribe on Stitcher, and check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.